Hello and welcome to Note to File, a clinical research podcast.
A collection of interviews, candid commentary, and general nonsense for the clinical research community.
Check us out at notetofilepodcast.com.
And now, without further ado, on to the show.
All right, guys. Hello. Welcome to another Note to File Live. I'm Brad, my co-host Denali. How's it going?
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Today is, what is today? May 8th.
May 8th, yeah. Thursday.
Right. Very good. Very good. And my two guests this week are the two new popes, Rohit and Jonathan. Guys, sorry, let me take you off mute if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Awesome. How's it going, guys?
Not too bad, Brad and Denali. Thanks for having us. I feel with that intro, I should be on a balcony somewhere providing a blessing.
You should at least have a funny hat on.
Or a bulletproof car.
Oh, nice. Unfortunately, I'm not fortunate to have either of those things.
Well, it's not too late, you know? It's not too late. Something to aspire to. Cool. Guys, let's jump right in. And, Rohit, I know you've been on before, but, do us a favor, tell us a bit about yourself and maybe about your origins in the clinical trial space.
Origins. Okay. Well, thanks again for having me on the show. I guess I haven't been on since we had the optical illusions starting out. So now that everybody's, I guess, sufficiently sedated, I can say my name is Rohit Nambishan. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Lokavant. I have been leading the thing that is Lokavant, the company that is Lokavant, for the better part of 7 years. So I must be a masochist. I'm a neuroscientist by training. I spent 10 years in academic and clinical research before moving into industry. Been in industry for 15, 18 years, something like that. Let's leave it there. And worked from big pharma to, I'd say, smaller healthcare organizations focused on healthcare IT or testing for meaningful use. I've worked with payer tech, which was an interesting experience. Leave it at that too. But came back to biopharma about 8 years ago at Roivant, and then helped spin out the company that is now known as Lokavant in January of 2020, which was a hell of a time to spin out a company. Pass it over to Jonathan.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. In spirit of everything, I feel blessed to be here today. But,
very good, very good.
Although hopefully people in a couple of weeks' time listening back, 8th of May is when the Pope was elected. But nice to meet you guys. First time on, so really appreciate the invite and to be here with Rohit as well. I feel like we've been doing quite a few things together the last while, Rohit. So it's like we have a little dynamic duo going on, which is great. But so my name is Jonathan Crowther. I am currently heading up a predictive analytics team within Pfizer's R&D unit. And my background, very similar. I've come from fundamental research where I really wanted to try and bring, from the bench, that translational medicine over to actually in the patient. And so I started to get involved in bioinformatics, which then brought me into this whole realm of tech. And then ever since then, I've kind of sat between two things, the fundamental research and the, real biological research over to then how do we apply technology? So I've seen over the last 7 years, 8 years in industry, maybe a bit longer, how we have so much at our fingertips, but we're just not leveraging it always as efficiently as we should be. And so we're starting to see that tide change, which is quite an exciting time. And hopefully, we'll have me on your show again in the future at some point if we do it right.
Beautiful. Yeah. So I guess tell me a little bit about what you guys have been working on. I know there was a recent announcement involving, forecasting. I'll be really honest. I read this stuff. I work at a site. I'm like, what the hell does this mean? And what does it mean for me, like at a site level, if anything? So if you would, explain it like I'm 5.
Maybe I'll take a first swat, and then Jonathan can correct all the inconsistencies I provide from my perspective. So I'll say this, there's a holy, in the spirit of today's election of the Pope, there's the holy grail in clinical research, which is really forecasting success. And success can mean different things to different people. But let's just say, the highest level is if the trial is going to be successful in achieving its endpoints, and can be proved to be eventually safe and efficacious for a population or cohort of patients, very specific patients, right? And that's the overall trial goal. Well, you can break that down into various different elements of success, right? There's the scientific success and meeting its endpoints and being safe. There's the operational success of achieving, primarily there's a number of the other aspects to it, but primarily achieving its enrollment goals within its time and budget, which how often does that always happen? I'll leave that as a question for everybody here. And then, in relation to that, how do you plan for success and expect to execute for that success? My experience way back in the day in larger pharma as well is we had these teams and these functions focused on planning. And their goal was to create a plan. And once they created the plan, it was like, yes, I met my goal. Great. Here's the executing team. Go after it and make this happen. But we're not really going to share much other than the fact that this is the plan at a high level. It's almost like the front end of an application. You don't know how it works under it. And then we always wonder why we don't execute as planned. And so from our perspective, the thing that we've been working on for a while now in various forms, and Jonathan give you his flavor from working on it inside large pharma, and I can give you my perspective of working on it with lots of different pharma companies and CROs, et cetera. How do you best leverage the information that can be available to predict operational success in a trial, namely enrollment success in a trial? And there's just so many caveats and so many decompositions, for lack of a better word, to dive deep in that rabbit hole per the visual illusion at the outset, that we can spend probably another 40 hours doing this. We can spend all week doing it. But at the highest level, that's what we have been working on for a while. We've now built a system that integrates, historical data from over 500,000 clinical studies. Now, not all data is considered equal, so we can get into that too. But what it essentially does is it allows a non-technical user to leverage the data in a technology forward way. We can break that down as well, so that we can create these highly precise forecasts specific to countries, specific to sites, specific to indications, and really specific to eligibility criteria, because otherwise, you're just creating a generalistic forecast that doesn't help anybody, right? And then iterate on that. And I think the other piece is we're living in a fairly uncertain world right now. There's lots of factors we can get into that as well, but clinical trials also have a significant amount of uncertainty to them, have had even before the markets became uncertain globally. So I would say that we've also taken an approach at saying, we're not just going to give you the answer, we're going to also tell you the uncertainty associated with those predictions, because those are really important too. Those are really important. You need to factor those in. And actually, it's not just about hitting the goal that we set. It's also about reducing that uncertainty. You can't reduce anything that you can't measure. So if we can measure it, then we can start to think about how to reduce it.
So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just quick questions just to make sure I'm understanding. So basically what you guys are looking at is how do you predict the operationalization success factors of a trial? You're not necessarily looking at like predicting the success of like the actual endpoints for the drug itself, right? It's more like, here's the drug, if it works or not, who the fuck knows, but we're going to make sure we test it the best, most efficient way we can. Is that fair?
So yes, and I'll just add one more point to that, which is science moves in leaps and bounds. The data science as a field didn't really exist as a major when I was going to school, but anyway, it is now. That concept has been kind of embedded within the clinical sciences, the biosciences, for decades. And thus we've gotten to precision oncology, and we're moving to precision immunology and precision neurology, et cetera, right? But in order to effectuate a trial in the real world, you need to make sure that the science that's gone into, the great science that's gone into creating a new therapy actually has the same amount of rigor, same amount of data science, same amount of thought, real deep thought, scientific thought in the operations. And so where we've focused is, let's bring that same rigor, that same mathematical rigor, that same statistical rigor and approach to the operations, which oftentimes kind of gets left by the wayside.
What a novel concept.
But I think as well, like it's interesting because if I look at it from the feasibility perspective that I've been doing over the last 7 years, right? There's so many variables that are changing all the time. Every minute, every day, every week, whatever way, however many times you look at it, it's going to change each moment. And what I like about it is the fact that we have, and I kind of liken it to like maps versus GPS. Right, because essentially before you pull a map out and you look around, and then you're not getting that real-time feedback. Whereas when you're actually there, looking at your CarPlay or wherever, whatever way you have it on your phone, you're starting to get that real-time feedback all the time. So as things are changing, we see higher rates of patient dropout. Right, we're starting to see site activations are either better or worse than what we would expect. And so in the build-up and the planning is so much better. And even if you think about, I mean, we've been using Monte Carlo simulation for a long time to say, let's look at our specific trial. What's similar? Oh, we've got all these, 6, 7, 10, 20 different reference studies that we'll use. And then we can use Monte Carlo and do some kind of forecast out, right? We don't factor in what's going on, or we factor in a rough idea of what we think site activation looks like. Then we draw this great curve. Then what happens is we realize things aren't working. We go back to the study team. We then make an amendment. We get this big change in the model and just completely changes over time. I think what we see happening here with Rohit is that those bands of confidence are getting narrower and narrower. So now we can go in and say, look, we expect this to happen within this time frame. And what's great is we can go to senior leaders and say, see your expectation, drop it. It's a shitty idea. It's not going to work. And its reality is this. Or we can go back even better and say, hey, we actually could do this better than you think. And in my view, I think that's where the value is, because it helps teams get better with that expectation management and then ultimately the delivery. And what I love about it is that everyone's looking for that gold star, like a COVID trial. Bam, we recruit in 3 months. It's awesome. But imagine across our portfolio and across the industry's portfolio as a patient, if we just make 10, 15% incremental improvement in how we do this, that impacts much more. So that's kind of the way I look at it. And before we even get into the technical side, just as a high level, that's what I think is pretty awesome about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm shocked to even learn at the site level that these things are being planned and forecasted to begin with, because it sure doesn't feel that way. When you're going through feasibility process or the startup process or literally any process in a clinical trial. So, and I guess another question, it makes me kind of wonder off the bat is, I mean, what kind of levers can you pull, in the beginning to sort of change that potential outcome? I mean, again, from where I sit, it feels so random sometimes at the site level. But I guess what are those sort of higher level, again, lack of a better word, like levers that can be pulled to potentially better operationalize things, or anything you've seen maybe so far in the sort of short time you've been doing this?
I think the first set of things, which I think would probably be more obvious to folks in clinical research, would just be things like enrollment rate, right? And the target participant accrual, which is usually set by the statistical plan. So it's not really that easy it's a negotiation, it's a debate, right? And yeah, I mean, I can make any forecast look great if I create the PSM rate of 50 patients per month. It'll be done in a couple days, a few hours, right? Perfect. But I think the challenge there is, first, how do you set those rates? What information can you use to set those rates? Yeah, you can toggle them all you want. I've seen, there's a great model at some point that I saw that someone said, "Oh, your model's not accurate because we see that we can actually recruit much faster for this very highly complicated, I think it was an oncology, rare oncology setting." I said, okay, great. And then we took out all the assumptions, like we redid our model and we just took out, we just assumed that every site in the entire study in every country would start at the same time, which of course happens 99% of the time, right? And we hit their model spot on. It's like, okay, we know what's the difference between our models, right? And so that begs the other piece, right? So site activation, what does the site activation timeline look like for particular countries and sites? And frankly, let's go back in time. Sites can't activate until you get the country approval. What's the country approval timeline, right? So you have to factor in, if you're going to talk about forecasting success enrollment, you have to factor in every step of the way that gets to the point where that enables a site to start enrolling patients, right? And those aren't fixed quantities. Those are distributions of information, and hence there's uncertainty in them, right? And so those are some of the initial toggles. And actually, that's where we started too. We started saying, okay, if we're going to start enrolling up at this site A in let's say Canada, then we need to know what the distribution of site activations would look like for sites like this in Canada. We need to understand what the approval timeline is in Canada for protocols like this, right, in this indication, in this phase, et cetera, and so on and so forth. And as we started working with different parties, we heard, obviously, it'd be nice if this wasn't always the case, but this is also how products get created organically. We started hearing, well, can you do this? Can you do that? And then you kind of start wondering, what's the common threads amongst these things? And you identify the real needs. And one of them was, well, if you're not looking at my eligibility criteria and factoring that in, you're not really providing me something very specific to the patient cohort I'm looking for, regardless of whether you have indication enrollment rates or site act. And what's interesting about that is, yeah, you typically wouldn't think of like, okay, so I'm just going to input eligibility criteria, this prose or semi-structured prose into a model. But, and I fought this for all because, apparently Gen AI is the solution for everything in the world these days. But it turns out that it's actually quite useful in this particular use case where you can process the eligibility criteria, a snippet of prose, vectorize it, create vectorized embeddings, and compare that to the vectorized embeddings of approximately 500,000 studies worth of data, right? And say these are the most similar ones. So you should use these to input into your forecast, the inputs to your forecast before you have live study data coming in. And as we talked more, then people asked us, okay, well, can we now factor in interim analyses and start to specify how can we change those and just and adjust those toggles? How can we adjust, the fact that a number of sites don't always enroll patient participants, right? How can we? So it goes on and on. There's now probably more fields and more toggles than anybody knows what to do with in our solution, and we have actually put that kind of behind the scenes and started recommending what folks should do. Because in the absence of that, we tried to create a model that matches what actually happens in the real world, right? Bring the rigor of data science to the operations of clinical research, and that a lot of crazy shit happens in the real world, and so therefore it's really complicated. So you go through these zigzags. I feel like you actually do represent it very authentically, and then you have to simplify it in some way, and you can simplify it based on leveraging different data models to recommend what they should do based on this indication in this country, etc. Jonathan, I'm sure you have a lot to add there in terms of.
Yeah, I not much more. Like in terms of, we can get down into the technical as much as we like. I think there's a couple of things that come from it, and one of them is the big E for me, which is explainability, right? And I want to kind of loop back to a point you made, Brad. Like from a site, you just thought it was this clunky, disorganized mess, right? And I can understand how you feel that way, right? But the reality is there are teams of people in the background who aren't just sending you annoying surveys over and over again and then saying, oh, actually, we're not doing that study anymore. Oh, we are doing it again. Do you want to, can you tell me what you told me already 3 weeks ago? I mean, you're nodding, so I know you know.
That would never happen. That would never happen.
I've been the guy who sent them, by the way, so you can send me hate mail. But
sure.
The reality is that, the planning right now is a mess. But if you see what Rohit is mentioning about having all those different features, taking them back, so we're kind of hiding it in a way, but then giving recommendations. The piece that's most valuable is the causal AI, right? Because essentially what you're looking at is you have like impact and effort, but like you have cause and effect. There's all those buzzwords, but cause and effect basically helping to point out, hey, this is where we have issues from our planning, or this is where we see the model is changing. So as Rohit said, like typically in clinical research, we have the curse of dimensionality with tons of columns. So with feature engineering, we're creating all these columns for our models. And they could be weird things. They could be like, how many miles is it to the next average 3 sites, right? All those kind of crazy features that pop up, Many patients have they had in the last 3 times and the integral of blah, right? And people lose that. If I come to you as a site and say, hey, we don't think you can actually do what you're saying on this survey because there's an integral that tells me this, you'd be like, well, go away. Same with study teams, right? We go to clinicians or we go to study managers and I say that, they'll be like, shut up, right? The reality is they're like, but I know this person. What we want to be able to say is like, hey, here are some really key features or parameters that we think are the drivers for the success or not. and how we understand them in planning today. And this is why we believe or don't believe that that's going to happen. Bringing that context or explainability to the team is an awful lot more powerful than just some nerd like me. And especially me, I'm an uber nerd, right? Biology and then technology together. I sit in front of people, they just glaze over most of
Double whammy.
Exactly. And, you know, so being able to come in and be really frank to say like, hey, your past performance is this, your PI actually doesn't have as much experience as the past performance has said. And if we look at patient access or we look at some recruitment value, we don't think that those three really correlate very well. And so that tells us we don't think you're going to deliver, or you will deliver, but you'll be 20% less than what you think, right? They're fair arguments we can have with study teams and with sites. And I think that's the dynamic we have to change, and using tools like Spectrum will help, because now you're starting to put things into the hands of analysts. And where generative AI, I agree, actually solves a huge amount of problems, maybe not the world's problems, but what it does is it brings context to a huge amount of data that I think a lot of people are lost in. And that's a really, really massive value add, because now we can have analysts run things, get explainability, get a forecast, and sit in front of somebody with a deck, or even better, the tool itself, and say, this is what we see and this is why. And that changes the landscape massively, in my opinion. It does me out of a job, but I think it's a good thing, right?
So is this primarily being focused towards like expectation setting and like site activation and recruitment, or are you taking this more upstream for like protocol design?
Yeah, I was going to ask
Great
that
question.
too.
So I'd say, you know, where Lokavant started was really in the conduct space, right? We were a conduct analytics platform for the first 3 years during the pandemic, where everything was at risk, right? And so we have been moving upstream. And so the approach that we've taken was taking a lot of the information we've gained through our conduct partnership customers, etc., and we leverage that information models to start planning better in the feasibility stages, right? And through that process, we're learning something more about how the protocol itself influences the planning. And the plan thereafter, not to be redundant, is to move upstream as well. And we've already started some of that work in research, kind of a study to VEC process, where we actually embed the entire protocol and start to do similarity clustering and understand, you know, when you're creating let's face it, anytime you're creating a protocol, most protocols right now are created based on comparator protocols right now anyway. It's a copy and paste. In fact, some of the biggest issues you see are copy paste issues, right? And so therefore, right, leveraging some of this technology that reduces, especially AIs, I think, my perspective on it is that it reduces a lot of the menial, tedious tasks. So bringing that study to VEC feature in place to basically cluster together the protocols and inform and generate language for those protocols quickly without the copy paste errors maybe, is a huge value add. We haven't, you know, I'd say that's still in a research mode per se. And what's more in a production GA kind of approach is the trial planning, the Spectrum suite that we talk about in trial planning and the conduct. Yeah. But the other point I'll make is, you know, Jonathan mentioned this as well. Yes, we do work before the study starts, right? The traditional feasibility phase. But the models that we are using, that this system is based upon, it actually adapts based on the best information that exists. So before the study starts, there's no actual live study data. So it consumes the information from the closest known study comparators, right? Leveraging Gen AI, et cetera, to identify that similarity ranking and eligibility criteria. But as you keep going, as you move into the study conduct, there's better information available. You actually get that within the study data, and it washes out some of the data that's used from study comparators and starts indexing more and more to that within study data. So it is dynamic in that way. And so I would say at this point, the bounds of the system are much more related to the planning and the execution. And there's a foray in the very near future that we've already started in research to do some of the protocol work.
Yeah, because when I think about, like, Jonathan, you mentioned, like, it helps you set expectations, whether it's going to be faster or slower. But I sort of think about, like, if I'm thinking about you're predicting something and saying, hey, this protocol is going to be trash because you have a placebo brain stint for 12 months for someone who has major depressive disorder, or like a placebo eye injections that they're going to get. And like, if your protocol design is fundamentally shit, I'm sure there's, you know, scientific and medical validity to, you know, what they've put into this. But like, from an experience perspective, from a recruitment, from an engagement perspective, it almost feels like you're going to do some of this. You're going to determine like, hey, this protocol is not going to be successful, full stop. And so it'd be great to take all of that and pull it back to say, like, fundamentally, let's stop trying to execute a shitty protocol.
Yeah.
Let's make the protocol better.
I think, you're 100% right. That's essentially what will happen. And if you think about what Rohit was saying about bringing in the copy and paste errors, when you start to really expand on that and you have somebody who they don't have to worry about what does this model say and how does that work, they can start to think more critically looking at their reference studies. So then, for instance, they can say, well, hang on, we're saying this is going to be delayed. Being able to redo that model in 5 minutes and changing the input to the model in terms of which reference studies we're going to use, as you say, this drug for sausage fingers, or whatever, a message you're going to, someone told me sausage fingers once, never since. But if you think about it, like, these inclusion exclusions are actually ridiculous or don't fit, or we understand why they're there, but if you look at the bolus of the reference studies, they're not there. Then you can actually also use the tool to make that argument. So if you're coming from a clinical team, you can sit there and say, look, all these reference studies don't have that. You're saying add it. If we add it in, or if we segment our reference studies with and without whatever endpoint or inclusion exclusion criteria, you could actually model them on the fly together and then sit in front of a study team and say, hey, okay, if we split them, these are the ones, this will be 3 months longer than this one, which will be 3 months shorter. So you can also start to build better arguments as well.
How receptive have your study teams been to engaging either with the outputs or the system itself?
Can I plead the fifth, or
you can?
But it depends. Everything, just like the study teams are as unique. Some people are super proactive and really eager to use the data. One of the things I'm doing a lot with teams, and any team really, is it's not data driven. That tends to push people away. It's data informed. Because when we say data driven, they feel like they're out of the picture and the data is making the decision. If we're saying it's data informed, you make the decision, but we give you the data to support that decision making. It changes it. And again, it goes back to the point, actually, tools like this really help, because people still feel like, I have to rubber stamp this. I have to make that final decision, and I'm using this data. And sometimes they're more receptive than if you just turn up and say, this is the model, do this.
Yeah. They still want a job.
Yeah.
Well, I think the other piece to that is, while we've moved leaps and bounds with explainable AI, as Jonathan was mentioning, and there's still a great amount of domain knowledge that's required to understand what the goal is and what the output of, how the output of the AI system actually solves that goal, right? I'm sure all of us have had experiences asking ChatGPT to optimize or rewrite pieces of language. I'll just leave it there. I won't get more detailed than that. But that being said, there are some fundamental flaws sometimes you see in logic, and that's after a while of seeing clusters of them, you realize it's something about the domain that as a human expert maybe, but as an expert that's not contained within the semantic understanding of that set of models. It's very good, it's amazing in some ways, but there's something missing in that sense. And so the process we've always taken has been said, yeah, we're going to apply these models as tools that the human can leverage, and they don't need to know how the model's created. They get a score out of it that tells them the similarity of this study with this eligibility criteria to a variety of other studies. They select them, and they're actively involved in the process of creating the output. Part of the logic there as well is, if you're actively involved, you're also committed to it, right? It's explainable to you if you're part of the process too. And to be clear, we're in a regulated environment. We can't just work with black box models. We have to have some understanding of the logic, and we need to be able to report it back very quickly when somebody senior to us asks us those questions. I think the second piece to that is the speed. In startups, they've been saying this since Mark Andreessen said software is going to eat the world, right? The idea here is startups have to move fast, right? And as things change, you can't always, especially in an environment of uncertainty like we're in. I'm beating a dead horse on that. But either way, when we're in a situation of uncertainty, you need to be able to move quickly. And in some senses, that's what startups are always facing: uncertainty, whether we're in this uncertain environment or we're in a different market, right? And so being able to move quickly And change and adjust things fast allows us to address, uncertain environments, or what we're expecting from what the study team is expecting, or what our governance team that we're trying to prove why we want to move the study into execution is expecting, etc. And so the speed of the execution of the model is one of the things we focused on expressly. And we want this to be something where you always will be able to get an output in 5 minutes, right? Not 5 weeks, not 5 months, because all of a sudden, some of our CRO partners have said, yeah, we do this RFP, and we run around with our hairs on fire, etc., to get this bid out, and then the sponsor comes back and says, oh, we're going to change 3 of the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then we run around like crazy again for another 5 days. And we wanted to reduce that. To Jonathan's point, we wanted them not to focus on going crazy and trying to figure out how to pull together data. We wanted them to spend their time critically thinking about things that the model can't provide, that domain experts can provide.
Yeah, I know, Jonathan mentioned, Monte Carlo simulations. Admittedly, I don't know that much about them. I do understand, they rely at least on accurate inputs or accurate assumptions. Rohit talked a little bit about historical data not being created equal. I guess what sort of limitations are there currently given the state of historical data? Is that a concern, or are you finding that to be an issue?
The variability between who runs and collects the data, right? So data is one thing, but if you have feasibility teams of 10, 15 feasibility analysts who run that data, you ask one person, or you ask 3 people to run the same protocol, you're going to get different inputs
of course,
every single time. So that's the biggest one that I see. And again, I think those things are the things that contribute to that gap, or that widening or shortening of the confidence interval you have in the data. The other part as well is that, depending on sponsor size, I'm lucky I come from an area where we can pay for a lot of the different tools and a lot of the different data sources. But if you're in a smaller pharma or a biotech, you don't have access to the same level of data. You're also restricted. So it's it's the elites versus the non-elites as well. It's just like we have in day-to-day life. It's the same across the organizations in terms of planning. And then, of course, it depends if you're CRO or not, or in-house, or do you check that against what the CRO is telling you too. So you have a ton of all these variables. I think something like Spectrum and working with Rohit, the advantage is going to be that you kind of normalize it a little bit. And, as you say, you can actually, because it's quicker, you can play with multiple different scenarios more, and you can pressure test things an awful lot more efficiently. And then also on top of that, if you are a manager, then you can have your teams check and double check and triple check, but do it in a day rather than a couple of weeks. So that would be the one thing. And the other piece, to Rohit's point earlier as well, is the scrambling of looking for, I said it the other day, dusty old spreadsheets where you have all your analysis and then things change with amendments. Then all of a sudden we have to rechange everything again. So that also introduces a level of variability, because if it's not the same analyst or the same CRO, and what we've seen before, the bait and switch with CROs, where you get the A team and then, all of a sudden you have the B team and then you have the C team who are running your trial, the same trial, as you have changes through the process, you also are introducing variability there, which leads to problems. So those that is what I would see from my experience.
Yeah. Do you think that's, go ahead, Rohit. No, I'm curious, is that a sort of an existential problem, within clinical trials? Is sites are so different. They do everything differently. Hell, we do things differently from study to study, admittedly. I work with the CROs or a sponsor who we have 3 studies with them. Well, they're all using different platforms and doing entirely different things. There's no consistency to begin with, which I imagine, again, I'm not a numbers guy, let's say, but I imagine that makes it very difficult to draw, accurate or confident predictions from, just because of the complete lack of consistency across all these different variables.
I liken it to the dark arts in my eyes.
Yeah, right.
Read
some tea leaves.
Yeah, I would say, before we even got into the forecasting business, so to speak, we were ingesting data at a site level from multiple partners and benchmarking performance. just to understand what performance looked like. And to your point, yes, there's a lot of differences in performance. If there weren't, we wouldn't have to use distributions. We just have a number, right? And you're seeing it obviously from the site side incoming, right? When I was on the sponsor side, I saw it from across multiple sites, right? And now where we sit, we see it from multiple angles, right? But I think the interesting thing there is, depending on how you construct those metrics, those benchmark metrics, right? You can normalize for the inconsistencies and different systems being used. It doesn't matter what CTMS system you're using if you're just evaluating how long did a site take to get to startup. Yes, there's variability there based, you could probably do a better analysis to understand, is that a factor? But ultimately, if this is the distribution of real site activation values, we want that variability. We want to actually consume that variability because that's going to inform the model and it's going to inform the uncertainty of that model. If we have, basically a site activation distribution that's very, very tight, and we sample from that distribution, which is effectively Monte Carlo, and run thousands of simulations on it, right? The uncertainty band, the confidence interval is going to be much tighter. And that might actually help you also decide which decisions on which partners you want to use as well.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask too. Like, to what degree can you say, like, oh, obviously this platform or practice, even, central recruitment versus not, whatever the case may be, you can start to see a trend of like, oh, this really works. Generally speaking, this doesn't, or even as much as like this particular platform from this company seems to help, whether that be the case or not. I mean, I think that's fascinating to me anyway.
Yeah, it's a cool use case there. But I think ultimately where we started from that perspective, interestingly enough, it was the first time we did that was during COVID, and we were looking at site performance pre-COVID and peri-COVID during the pandemic, and then we updated that, post-COVID, whatever that means, right? And there were significant KPIs, like metrics, that had shifted. We all assume it, right? But even some of the KPIs we assumed to change didn't change, like dropout and things like that. Of course, there's also effects by the therapeutic area. If you're if you're an oncology patient and phase 3, phase 4, COVID be damned, you're probably going to try to make your visit if there's no good therapy for you, right? And so some of that stuff is explainable. But I would just say that the forecasting, to your question about the data leverage for this, yes, it's variable. And frankly, we want it to be representative of the actual variability in the real world, because we don't want to set ourselves up for, oh, we're going to finish this study in a year. Yeah. 4 years later, you're still trying to figure out on the 5th protocol amendment what went wrong, right? So we've got to stop shooting ourselves in the foot in that way. There's so many deleterious issues associated with that for patients, for sites, for everybody is loses in that situation.
We do have a question from the audience that I don't even understand, but I'm going to read it anyway. How long is the context window of your model, and does it have function call capabilities? Maybe you guys can interpret that for me.
Context window. So it's an interesting question. I might need a little bit more context in the question as well if the LinkedIn user is hearing this right now. Context window of the model. I mean, so just I'll assume what the question means and provide a response. And Jonathan, feel free if you know better than I do on the question. But there was a CRO leader once that told me that all studies are feasible with enough time and enough money. And while that is true, it's not particularly practical. And so what we've done is we've created a window for feasible forecasts that is configurable. So the user can say, I want to look for 10 years out. I want to look for 9 years out. I want to look for 5 years out. We've already heard feedback from one partner that, hey, that's not going to work for my influenza study. It's like, oh, I guess we didn't think about that. So let's extend that to 15, 20 years, right? It's very simple to do on our platform. So in terms of the ability to forecast out, if that's what the question is about, that is actually configurable by the user.
I think,
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think they're more talking context window is kind of with the LLMs, how much tokenization you're using. So it's obviously going to be dependent on the model that you have. And I was trying to look through some of the documentation. I suppose that's probably part of your secret sauce, Rohit, right? Which you may not give out on a podcast, but it would be within the realms, I imagine, of what you have with like GPT-4, 4.0, 4.0 Turbo. So it could be about 300-400 pages of text, I imagine. But again, you probably have to check with Aaron to answer that question again.
Yeah, I definitely could check back and get back to that person if they want to reach out as well.
Yeah, there's some more technical.
Yeah, definitely more technical that I can answer right now on the call, but I'm happy to touch base.
No, Rohit, we want all your IP right now.
I was going to say, yeah.
That's
Please and
why.
thanks.
Let me.
Why we got you on
I
here.
can take a screenshot. No, but we can do that. And to be clear, because the main focus for the model, the fine-tuned LLM that we've utilized, is just eligibility criteria. It's not extensive. Our context window probably wouldn't be terribly extensive, but that being said, for instance, images, text, characters, the user inputs in the chatbot.
But we know there's what 500,000 trials historically. How many? What percent of them do you think is pulled in?
Of the 500,000 trials, we've like over 90% at this point.
So then removing the duplicate index endpoint, etc. stuff from it, I imagine there's a pre-processing there. So I would say it would be within the GPT-4 4.0 levels. So it's about 150,000 tokens, something like that.
And to be clear, that's actually when we first mocked this up. Not surprisingly, we used GPT-4 just to see if it would work, and it worked more or less reasonably. And then we took it off OpenAI and optimized our own version, our own model, etc. Right. So I would say that's probably about right. But for that very technical question and follower out there, I'm happy to put you in touch with Aaron Mackey, who will be able to provide you a much better response than me.
And that LinkedIn user is Kelvin Peak. So what's up, Kelvin? I don't know why. I don't know LinkedIn's rules about telling me who the user is, but if you want to circle back at all. Very good. We're getting up close to the end here. If you guys have any more questions, get them in. So I mean, what's the future hold?
Oh man.
And I will hold you to it.
You're gonna come back to me.
I'm gonna snip this. Yep, I'm gonna snip this. I'm gonna put remind me 3 years and expose you if you're wrong, or give you your props if it's right.
Well, I definitely won't say we're going to be able to do molecular sequencing on a whole body in one drop of blood, because that's going to get me in a lot of trouble.
Well, you just said it, and I can snip that out and make it look like you did say it.
Well, you could have done that. You could have
deep fake.
This whole thing is deep fake.
Me saying that anyway, right?
Good point.
You have enough data here. Probably about 100,000 tokens worth. But mine's going to be more extensive. Jonathan, you want to provide your thoughts before I go here?
Yeah, I'll go quickly then. I think next 3 years we're gonna have planning which is more adaptive, much like the trials that we have right now. I think a higher reliance on live data impacting changes to forecasts. I think we should, and I hope this is the one you're going to hold over me now, Brad, right? Is we should have more interplay between the sites and the sponsors with models. I think we should sit in front of the sites when we do feasibility and actually say, this is what we see about you. And this is because I think right now, like you say, it's a dark corner. You don't know what we're thinking and what we're saying about you. And in reality, I feel teams should sit down with you guys and say, hey, you sent me that. That's a crock of shit. Like, I don't believe that, and this is why. And then you have an opportunity to come back and contest it and say, well, actually, we've changed all of this. And our PI is like super motivated to be part of this. We're really into that drug or whatever that modality is and very excited. And I think being able to capture more of that subjective data into these models as well, because right now we kind of pick it up with what we see from the historical data and what the current trending. But I would love to be able to measure your thoughts, like sit with you in a call, record what you're saying, take that sentiment and then apply that to the model as well. So I think kind of a back and forth, and then being able to leverage all of that information when we start to get to protocol designs in the future, so that we actually are playing chess rather than checkers when it comes to planning.
I like it. Yeah, I think if this does open up like conversation about these things, I mean, I think that would be a great outcome. Again, just to be able to know rather than sort of getting peppered with FQs and then maybe hearing something back and maybe not. It'd be great if they're like, hey, no, we know that you're full of shit because you said this, but we know this. Well, okay, well, if you knew it, then why didn't you just tell me to begin with, and we could have worked together? And maybe it is. Maybe like, hey, you're right. This is a terrible study for us. So let's both part ways.
The only thing, the good that comes from that are things like SIP and these profiles that sites have to fill in, hopefully start to actually get completed fully. And so we get more information, because I think the sponsor should also be sharing what, not only if you're part of Transcelerate, right, you can share your CTMS, but we should also be sharing like the real capabilities, what we know about the site, but then with the site input as well, I think would be pretty powerful.
Well, I think fundamentally, we had a conversation a couple of weeks back about this in general, about how communication between sites and sponsors is a huge issue that sort of like perpetuates across so many different spaces. And so, to your point, Jonathan, to what you mentioned earlier, if this could be used as a tool to say, hey, this is some data insights that we've gleaned from you. Not like this is the decision, but this is a tool to sort of guide that conversation and facilitate more communication between sites and sponsors. I can only see that being a positive.
I have a dream of making it like Tinder, right? So literally, as a site, I know you look weird about it, but
I love it. I'm in it. I'm
the
first investor.
You come in on the site and just swipe left, right on the protocols. I mean, how good would that be?
Just let me take some good profile pictures.
Yeah.
All right, you're all drum rolled up.
I would extend upon that, given the last few minutes, is that I would make it a little more extendable to other groups too. CROs have a lot of great information they may not want to share, but if you can do that in a manner that keeps secure, maybe even a federated data model, but also a federated analysis module that allows that information to be shared, that provides the same insights to the CRO, to the site, to the sponsor, so they can work collaboratively to improve the situation, that would be amazing, right? I know that there are portals, multifaceted portals that have a sponsor side. They have a CRO side, etc., right? And a site side, but the communication is lacking, and to some degree, that's why we keep asking, or the sponsors and CROs keep asking, what's a good site engagement metric? How do we measure site engagement? Well, start engaging with the sites. Right. And part of that is, if we don't, I know, maybe to pull it full circle, if we're not singing from the same hymnal, right, we're not actually able to effectuate the change we want to effectuate. And where you're going to effectuate that is at the site level. But it needs the sponsorship to do that. It also needs collaborators operationally, which often you find in the CROs, to make that happen.
Amen. All right, guys. I think it's a great place to leave it. Denali, any final thoughts?
No, I mean, we covered religion and politics. I think we checked all the boxes we came to talk about today.
It's true.
American Pope.
Is it?
Oh, really?
Who is it?
Chicago.
Oh, nice.
Midwest.
There you go.
Okay, good stuff. Well, all right. Thanks, guys, for coming on. What we got next week, Denali?
We got Matthew Holt on Tuesday, and then a Sticky Notes on Wednesday. So we're going to be a busy couple weeks.
Oh, man, I don't know. How much are we making off of each episode?
Well, you tell me.
That's right. $0. Guys, thanks for listening. Thanks, Rohit. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks, guys.
Hope to have you guys back. Definitely gonna have you back in 3 years now, so I can replay these clips to you and say whether you were right or wrong. So we're out, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Note to File. We're committed to continuing to bring you independent and unfiltered coverage of the clinical trial industry.
We want to talk about what you want to hear. So if you have something on your mind, hit us up at notetofilepodcast.com.